Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session on religious minorities. Before we get underway, I'd like to invite you to bear in mind that the campus of the ANU is on land that for thousands of years, in fact even tens of thousands of years, has been under the stewardship of Australia's First Peoples. So we honour them for their custodianship of the land that we now enjoy, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and hopefully into the future too. Before we get to our speakers, let me just take a couple of seconds to set the scene for the session in very broad brush terms. I think there are probably three main categories of religious minorities in Indonesia, each with its own theological, sociological and legal attributes and challenges. And I'm using basically I'm going to try and mention them here using the definition given yesterday by Robert Cribb, the traditional definition of what a minority is. First, as we are aware, somewhere between 85 and 90% of Indonesians self-identify as Muslims. So the other five so-called official religions are minority religions: Christians, divided into Protestants and Catholics conventionally, Hindus, Buddhists and Confucians, plus what we heard yesterday from Tim Lindsay and Simon Butt, the very interesting notion of beliefs contrasted with religion, and some of these beliefs having a contested but increasingly official recognition in recent times, but still contested. Secondly, within Islam, there are sectarian minorities and splinter movements, often called sempalan, that claim to be Islamic but are rejected as Islamic by representatives of the mainstream. For example, the followers of Ahmadiyya and Shia Muslims, followers of Lia Aminuddin, for example, and perhaps even some of the liturgical variants such as the Witu Telu movements or Muslims in Lombok, maybe the Kebatinan, some of the Kebatinan movements of Java. And third, of course, mainstream Muslims themselves are a minority in certain parts of the country. And in some places they're actually quite a small minority. In Bali, for example, in Flores and Timor, in NTT, in Papua province, Manado, and so on. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, somewhere in this mix there is the most oppressed and most hidden of the religious minorities of Indonesia, Indonesia's atheists. Now, with that rough and ready typology, let's get down to business. We have, would you join me in welcoming our panel of speakers, please, this morning? Thank you very much. Our first two speakers are Marcus Mietzner and Burhanuddin Muhtadi, who will be putting statistical flesh on the issue of Muslim intolerance towards religious and ethnic minorities. Each of our speakers, well, you two have 20 minutes. Each of our speakers have 20 minutes, and then we will have time for question and answer at the conclusion of the three presentations. So Marcus and Burhan, you have 20 minutes from now. Silakan.
Thank you very much, George. Lots of material to go through, so we'll get right to it. What we are going to talk about today is what has been, of course, referred to a lot yesterday, and that is the impact, possibly also the causes, of the anti-Ahok demonstrations in 2016 and 2017. What do these demonstrations tell us about the level of intolerance among Indonesian Muslims towards religious minorities and the ethnic Chinese? Okay. I was told not to put the microphone over my nose so that it doesn't appear in the picture, so I'll get closer to it. So we are addressing three major questions here that were emerging in the last 2 years in the debate on the anti-Ahok demonstrations. And these three questions are, number one, were these protests really representative of deep-seated discriminatory sentiments within the Indonesian Muslim community, or, and Robert referred to that yesterday, were these simply Muslims who out of piety felt obliged to express their dissatisfaction over Ahok's alleged blasphemy? So were they simply following the piety that they feel they need to express? Secondly, we are addressing the question of causes and effect to the extent that that is possible, because you will recall, of course, that when the anti-Ahok demonstrations happened, there was a lot of debate about whether they were caused by rising Islamic conservatism within Indonesia, and indeed you could say that was the consensus in the foreign media commentary about those events. So we're going to ask, is this accurate? Was indeed rising Islamic conservatism the cause for these demonstrations? Or conversely, in fact, were the demonstrations then impacting on that level of intolerance among Indonesian Muslims? So two completely different things. Were the demonstrations caused by rising conservatism, or was Islamic conservatism rising as an impact of the demonstrations? And third, we are interested in who the intolerants are among the Indonesian Muslim community in terms of income levels, in terms of education. Are these lower class Muslims? Are they the highly educated? Also a big debate, of course, not only in the case of Indonesia, but across debates about Islamist mobilization, populist mobilization across the world. And finally, also, of course, a debate at the time, was this just a situational event, one very much created by the context of Ahok and his actions at the time? And when we took surveys at the time and they showed increased intolerance, was this something that would simply fade away as we, in terms of sort of temporal distance, move away from that point of time? So were the signs of intolerance that we clearly saw during these demonstrations, were these a product simply of the anti-Ahok hype at the time and have waned since, or are these sentiments persisting? Let me just, before I hand over to Burhan, let me give you our answers in brief, and then Burhan will lead you through the data, because the data can be overwhelming. So it's good if you know where this is traveling. So for the first question, we did find that there is about 30% within the Indonesian Muslim community that can be categorized as very intolerant. Burhan will explain to you in detail how we categorize these particular items. 30% who reject Muslims in political positions, who reject Muslims holding religious events in the neighborhood, and so on, and also 30% roughly who hold really deeply discriminatory views towards ethnic Chinese. The second question about the relation between cause and impact, we found that the demonstrations could not have been caused by rise in Islamic conservatism, because as the data shows, that conservatism was in fact declining before the anti-Ahok demonstrations and then rose sharply after the demonstrations. So we believe that our data shows that in fact the second of these hypotheses are true, that Islamic conservatism was escalated, was sharpened by the demonstrations rather than being caused by them. Thirdly, we look at the socio-demographic data. We find that Prior to the anti-Ahok events, there was a shift in that socio-demographic profile away from the poor and undereducated towards the higher class Indonesian Muslims. So 2016, at the onset of the anti-Ahok demonstrations, we found that the upper classes, the higher educated, the high-income Indonesian Muslims were more prominently represented in this pool of intolerance than the poor and the undereducated. That all changes after the demonstrations, because the demonstrations then pull in particularly the undereducated and the poor, so the recruitment into intolerance is stronger in that segment of Indonesian Muslim society. And finally, as you will probably guess, we found that the level of intolerance has not been waning at all. It's been going up. It's been going up consistently. And as Burhan will show you now, in a survey we've done just last month, it continues to rise. So the hope that some had during that time, that the anti-Ahok demonstrations were simply an expression of that period of time and it would go away, that has not materialized. So Burhan will now lead you through the data of the first two segments addressing these two questions. I will come back for the third and then do the conclusions as well. So please welcome Burhan.
Thanks, Marcus. I would like to start with 2018 figure drawn from national survey we conducted in August by Indonesian Survey Institute. LSI is one of reliable polling organization in Indonesia with a proven track record. You can assess their track record by comparing their pre-election surveys and quick count with official electoral outcomes. And what's the level of intolerance among Indonesian Muslims toward religious and ethnic minorities today? Let me briefly explain the methodology used in the survey. The population of the survey is all Indonesian citizens who have a right to vote. A total of 1,520 respondents were selected by using multi-stage random sampling method. And based on this number of samples, an estimated margin of error is about 2.6% at 95% level, confidence level. And selected respondents were interviewed face-to-face by our trained interviewers. We measure level of Muslim intolerance by using an index created from 6 major questions. So this question assess objection of Muslim toward first the holding of religious events by non-Muslim in the neighborhood, the building of non-Muslim places of worship, non-Muslim as mayors or regents, non-Muslim as governor, objection to non-Muslim as vice president, and non-Muslim as president. Of course, we also measure the level of intolerance among Indonesian non-Muslim. You can discuss this in Q&A, but in this presentation, I would like to focus on the level of intolerance among Muslims. And using the index developed from the answer to this question, the percentage of Indonesian Muslim holding strong or some intolerance views toward non-Muslim stood at 47.8%. If we further disaggregate the index into a political index, political intolerance index consisting on question on objection of non-Muslim holding political office, and religio-cultural index consisting of 2 measures asking Muslim objection whether non-Muslim events or non-Muslim places of worship, we note some significant differences. So in these partial indexes, you can see that 54.2% were politically intolerant in 2008, while around 39% of Muslims could be religio-culturally intolerant. In August 2018 data set, we also developed our Radicalism Index that measures Islamist radical acts by using 5 items, including demonstrating against people or groups supposedly contradict Islamic values, like Ahmadiyya or Shia. And then conducting unauthorized sweeping venues not complying Islamic law, like gambling, prostitute location, pubs, bars, and participating in attacking houses of worship belonging to other religion. And each of these items were asked both in actual and hypothetical dimension. For example, if Muslim surveyed said never, they were inquired whether they would do so if the opportunity arose. And using the index developed based on response to this question, 11% of respondents were considered to be willing to be radical and 0.3% radical. In addition to target non-Muslim, many Islamist radical acts often have explicit anti-Chinese connotation. So it is necessary to explore whether the resentment toward non-Muslim different from or congruent with anti-Chinese prejudices. So in order to measure social anti-Chinese sentiment among Indonesian Muslims, we asked a number of questions that had been first asked during our 2017 survey with LSI and ISIS Yusuf Ishaq Institute from Singapore. And among others, if you can see from this slide, 2018 results show that 36% of Indonesian Muslims believe that Chinese only care about their own kind. 33% thought that Chinese possess a culture that was incompatible with Indonesia. And then 32% Indonesian Muslims were convinced that Indonesian Chinese still loyal to the People's Republic of China. And then 35% opined that Chinese were too greedy and ambitious. So overall, it is clear that about 1/3 of Indonesian Muslims held strong socio-racial prejudices against ethnic Chinese. While the data established the current level of intolerance among Indonesian Muslims, it tells us little about how this trend developed over time. For this, we need to compare our 2018 data with the previous data set on the same and or similar measure. So it is clear, if you can see from this slide, that the overall intolerance index combined by 2 political intolerance index and religio-cultural index has increased 2 years in a row. In 2017, it was 50.4, while 2016 was only 48.6. When we disaggregate our intolerance index into a political and religio-cultural sub-indexes, with the former consisting of measures assessing objection to non-Muslim holding political position, of course, if you look at this table, there was a significant change. Prior to the anti-Ahok protests, the average objection of Muslim to non-Muslim holding political position stood at 42%. In 2017, just after Ahok imprisonment, this average shot up to 49.6%. And the objection to non-Muslim holding political office rose again sharply between 2017 and 2018, reaching a record level of 54.6%. So clearly, our 2018 data remove any speculation that a rise in political intolerance just only a temporary in nature or likely to fade. The increasing trend of political intolerance after the anti-Ahok demonstration means that hardening Islamist views in the Muslim population could not have caused the mobilization. Instead, it was the anti-Ahok demonstration that hardens such exclusivist attitudes. So the indication that the anti-Ahok demonstration drove up intolerance rather than being caused by it are further strengthened by examining the trend in the religio-cultural sub-index. So you can see from this slide, the sub-index contains two measures, as I said earlier. First is about Muslim objection to religious events by non-Muslim, and the second one, Muslim objection to non-Muslim building places of worship. And for this measure, we have 2010 and 2011 data point. So they show prior to the anti-Ahok demonstration, basically the level of religio-cultural intolerance had been declining dramatically, with objection to non-Muslim houses of worship falling from 64% 2010 to 60.6% 2011 and 52% 2016. Of course, still high, but the trend was declining. But the data from 2018 clearly shows that for the first time in decade, a religio-cultural intolerance is rising again. Both the measure on non-Muslim events and places of worship recorded increase in 2018, returning roughly to 2016 level. So hence, while the two intolerance sub-indexes diverged during anti-Ahok demonstration, the post-2018 patterns shows a single trend upward. So this suggests that events of late 2016 and early 2017 not only not waning in the impact, as Marcus said, rather the crisis left a long-term legacy of rising intolerance in all political and social aspects, with the spike in political intolerance ultimately infecting and undermining tolerance toward spiritual dimension of non-Muslim society as well. The same is also true in our Radicalism Index. The percentage of those willing radical rose from 7.7% in 2016 to 9.3% 2017, and just recently 11% in 2018. Last slide before I hand over to Marcus. But there is a striking difference, however, between the trend in cultural intolerance toward non-Muslim and toward Chinese. Recall that in 2018, about a third of Indonesian Muslims held prejudicial views against ethnic Chinese. Of course, this is a significant number, but it is much reduced from 2017. So the average from the four measures that I have already explained earlier on social anti-Chinese prejudice have declined since 2017. This suggests that resentment toward non-Muslim has consolidated much more strongly as a result of anti-Ahok demonstration than social objection toward ethnic Chinese. Now we turn to socio-economic profile of the intolerance, and Marcus will end up with the conclusion. Thank you very much.
So I've already been shown the door basically here. So very briefly on what I already explained to you early on. So what we see in the social demographic developments here is that in 2010, 2011, that's the first time we took these surveys, you had a clear relationship between intolerance towards non-Muslims and income levels, in the sense that the richer you were, the less likely you were intolerant. That all changed, as you can see here in the 2016 data, where the higher education, and it's the same in the higher income bracket, community was actually now, for the first time, more intolerant. However, and it's very complicated, so we can go back to that in the Q&A, but what the mobilization against Ahok then did was pulling in really very strongly the poorly educated and the low-income Indonesians into the community of intolerance, so that by now, by 2018, you have the strongest rise. So first in 2016 to 2017, you have a rise of 8.8%. That is, of course, also the largest community in terms of numerical numbers, total numbers, and then another rise in 2018. However, and that's the complication of the 2018 data, we see now a spike again in this very high education bracket as well. So for the 2018 data, and specifically, we see the highest rise in intolerance in the very lowly educated and the most highly educated. We explained to you that we disaggregated between political intolerance and religio-cultural intolerance. You see here as well in this data that initially between 2016 and 2017, there was a decline throughout the anti-Ahok demonstration, but by 2018, this is on the rise again, and once again, the biggest rises in 2018 happen in the low education bracket and the highest education ones. Let me come just briefly to some conclusions. First of all, I think we did show that roughly 30% of Indonesian Muslims hold strongly intolerant views towards non-Muslims and also towards ethnic Chinese. Let me remind you, however, it's very important to state that if you do similar research in Australia, in Europe, in the United States, you find very similar numbers, of course, of prejudices to non-Christians, for instance, to Muslim minorities, and in some cases, the numbers are even worse. So we are not trying to establish a case here of Indonesian exceptionalism. In fact, we're doing the opposite. We're locating Indonesia in a worldwide trend of populism and rise of sectarian sentiments. Secondly, again, this was important for us to establish what were the cause and the impact of the anti-Ahok mobilization. I think we've showed that before the anti-Ahok mobilization, especially in terms of religio-cultural intolerance, so the questions about houses of worship and non-Muslim events in the neighborhood, all of that was declining, and declining, in fact, throughout even the anti-Ahok demonstrations. But for the first time in a decade now, we see that on the rise again after the anti-Ahok demonstrations. So clearly, this points to the central role of religio-political entrepreneurs mobilizing intolerance rather than intolerance being the cause for the mobilization. Again, as I indicated, in terms of the socio-demographic profiles of the intolerance, that changes as well as a result of the anti-Ahok demonstrations. It's particularly the poor and the lowly educated that are drawn to these messages of intolerance mobilized by political religio elite. Finally, again, it's very important to state that whoever thought that this was a temporary event that would fade in time, this is clearly not the case. Our last survey, just last month, taken almost 2 years after the onset of the anti-Ahok demonstrations, shows that intolerance has entered the mainstream. The mainstream is now something that all politicians have to take into account when making key decisions. And Tom has showed you yesterday how Jokowi has responded to that, and the appointment of Ma'ruf Amin, for instance, as the running mate of Jokowi is a direct result of the data we just presented to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus and Burhan. Now, our next speaker, Ihsan, would you silakan? Yeah. We have to rush on.
Oh, okay, I will.
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. I will, yeah, I will. Good morning, everyone. Sedih ya, it was sad to hear Marcus and Burhan's presentation today. But I'm working with Paramadina University. I have been working in the last 20, 30 years with Paramadina. But please, we have nothing to do with you know, Jakarta governor now. So please let me stay at least until tomorrow. Don't do. I really am looking forward to see the flowers today, and I really hope that I will be bringing some good news from local politics and FKUB. Really sad, yeah. I've been listening with Sandra this morning. Really sad. Okay. But my subject this morning is mediating dispute over places of worship in Indonesia. Okay. Sad, Marcus. This is an increasingly important type of religious conflict in Indonesia, especially over the construction of churches in western part of the country, but also lately over the construction of mosques in certain part of eastern Indonesia. So this has direct consequences to the relationship between majority and minority religious group in the country. Remember, as George Quinn said before, even if the Christians are generally minority in Indonesia, there are certain Christians group who are majority groups in certain eastern part of Indonesia, of the country. Also, the conflict usually took the form of interreligious dispute between Muslim and Christians and vice versa. The type of conflict sometimes also took sectarian tone when certain Sunni Muslim mainstream rejected the presence of the Hamid Mosque in places like, I think, Depok in Western Java. So this morning I will now look specifically at the role played by the Interreligious Harmony Forum. I will call FKUB, Forum Kerukunan Umat Beragama. As I will explain later, this FKUB is a new institutions, the product of our Reformasi era, with the mandate to manage interreligious harmony. But there are two additional reasons why studying FKUB's mediatory role is important, necessary. First, mediation has become an increasingly popular method for government and civil society group in dealing with religious conflict. And FKUB's mandate to work mostly with that mediations. And secondly, the most important policymakers in Indonesia, Jokowi, Pak Lukman Hakim Saifuddin, also our head of our Indonesian Police Force, Pak Tito, suggested to expand the role of the FKUB and the mandate to be strengthened. This presentation is based on the study of mediation of dispute over the construction of Nur Musafir Mosque in Kupang, in eastern part of Indonesia, in East Nusa Tenggara, and the dispute over a closure of Christian church in Gunung Kidul in Yogyakarta. I will discuss the findings from these two cases with other findings also that we know before. This is part of our larger project that Pusad has been doing with the help of Indonesia Project, KSI, which is Knowledge Sector Initiative, and also with the help from Sandra, Hamid at the Asia Foundations. I would like to make two main observations before in advance. One, with the assistance of FKUB and other civil society groups, local government can quickly and correctly handle religious-based conflict and guarantee the religious freedom of minority groups in some place in Indonesia. And secondly, civil society organization can play a very strategic role in strengthening FKUB and government, both at the local, regional, and national level, in resolving religious conflict. But first of all, what is the FKUB? As I said before, this is a new institution established on the basis of the joint regulation of Minister of Religious Affairs and the Minister of Home Affairs of 2006. This PBM, Peraturan Bersama Menteri, is meant to replace the joint decree of the Minister of Religious Affairs and Minister of Internal Affairs of 1969. To understand the spirit of PBM 2006, it is important to understand the historical context of this replacement. But in short, we can conclude that the new regulations is meant to be more democratic than the one that was ordered before. Under the new order, if a religious community plan to build a house of worship, they must have permission from local government head. In practice, however, local government head only issued a permit if they already had a recommendation from the military-led Special Territorial Administration, Pelaksana Laksusda, Pelaksana Daerah. If you get the permission from Laksusda, so everything would be smooth and easy. Under Reformasi era, the new regulations specifically address which organization should have the authority to maintain interreligious harmony, what are the mechanisms behind the granting of permits for construction of places of worship, and what are the means for resolution of conflict should it occur. And here is where FKUB came in. Here, under the Reformasi era, maintaining interreligious harmony is seen as the collective responsibility of both the government and the religious communities. The government is represented by the governor on the provincial level and the region or major at the regency level. On the other hand, the aspirations of religious communities are represented by religious leaders in the FKUB, this is interfaith, interreligious organizations. There are 21 members of the FKUB at the provincial level, and there are 17 members of the FKUB at the region and city level. On my slide, you can see Jokowi has a meeting with the FKUB officials from all provinces in the police. Jokowi summoned them and asked their support to ease the tensions after the Jakarta elections. Some of them, the FKUB officials, quite cynically say that Jokowi and his men only called them when he and other men really need them, but left them unfunded when they don't need them. They were treated like, this is what they called pemadam kebakaran, firefighters, or ambulance. They call me only if they need me. Let me now turn to the first case, which is the dispute of a mosque in Nusa Tenggara, East Nusa Tenggara. I can tell you the story in detail, but here is the rough chronology. Planned to build mosque, Nur Musafir Mosque, in 2003, so back like 18 years ago, was protested by local Christians. They said the site was very close to Christian neighborhood, where they raise not only chicken but also pig in some neighborhood. So how can you build a house while in the area there are also people who raise pigs? And apparently they also wanted to show, the Christians, local Christians also wanted to show their solidarity towards their Christians co-religionist brothers in Java, whose plan to build churches were also protested by Muslims. When I did a research on this very issue in Ende, in eastern part of in East Nusa Tenggara also, a Christian respondent said, we did this by taking example from you Muslims actually in Java. We saw it on TV, and if you can do that against our churches in Java, why do you think I can do the same thing here against your mosque? Bad example. The dispute was also aggravated by politics ahead of 2007, by local elections. Kupang Major and Deputy Major who won the election and ran for from 2007 to 2012, won the election with the support from the PKB. Everyone knows, I think, PKB is the Partai Kebangsaan, National. Well, they said National Erection Party, but it's actually National Renaissance Party, right? Okay, Awakening Party. 5 minutes, okay. Because of the above protest, the initial site was relocated in 2008, and the permit to build mosque was released by FKB in 2010. But this new plan also protested. Some local Christians accused that there was manipulation to collect signatures needed to get the construction permit. So the dispute continued. In 2011, local election again complicated the conflict, but this time the incumbent lost and the new independent candidate won. So this is also good news from local politics. And soon after that, in early 2013, the new elected mayor established a fact-finding team to investigate the dispute. And based on this finding, the new mayor officially terminated the mosque construction plan. But later, this year, 2013, and led by this new local leadership, the Muslim restarted to collect the signatures needed, and the dispute was basically practically resolved in the late 2016. How the dispute was resolved? First, as I have before, there is new governor is coming in, and he is neutral, and he led actually the reconciliations effort. Secondly, and more importantly, there is a more informal approach has also taken place. Civil society organizations played a major role to ease the tensions, particularly peacemaker youth community at Kupang, Kompak. They did interfaith dialogue, particularly among the local youth. They demanded more commitment from local government and religious leaders, and they also encouraged Muslims to voice their demand for the new mosque. Third, learning from there was also learning from the voice of the victim in Java, a human rights organization called Sobat KBB, Solidarity for the Victim of Discrimination Against Religious Freedom and Belief, invited activists such as Pak Palti Panjaya. You can see in the picture, he said, actually, you are not the victim, I am the victim. I am the victim of the religious discrimination in Bekasi, and I do not want to see this kind happening also in this place. Please, peace, let peace came from the east to the west. Let the east let the east give a good example to the west. That's good news from. Let me turn to the second case, and I'll end with some conclusions. While the first dispute in Kupang concerned the construction of mosques, this time it concerned the Christian church in Yogyakarta. In 2010 and 11, some Muslim protested against the Pantai Coastal Church in Indonesia that hosted a community service program, KKN actually, for seminary in Semarang. They accused this kind of Christianizations. 2013, further mobilization took place. Local Muslim invited a speaker from Front Jihad Islam, a notorious vigilante group in Yogyakarta, for Tabligh Akbar. In the speech, he demanded the church to be closed and the reverend to be expelled from the village. In 2014, a civil society group, again, assisted the church leader to demand more commitment from the FKB and local government, and in 2011, 2016, local government led negotiation and the dispute was finally over. How, again, the dispute was over? It started with the NGO advocacy. On November 2014, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika National Alliance, ANBT, one of the most active civil society organizations in Jakarta and around the country, actually, invited a church leader to workshop on freedom of religion. They endorsed non-legal approach to settle the issue. In early 2015, the church leaders started approaching the local government to respond to reopen the church. And this time, local government was quite responsive. Gunung Kidul region appointed the first regional assistant, ASDA, assistant daerah, Tommy Harahap, in the picture, who handled government affairs to resolve the case. And very interestingly, Tommy came from a military family and admits to love Pancasila and Sukarno, both Sukarno and Soeharto. Well, and soon, so he started leading the resolution of conflict. On the issue of Christianity, he said this is not only the issue for Muslims, this is also the issue for Christians, because there are Christians have so many denominations, and there is also a proselytizations within the same Christians, mencuri domba, stealing the sheep from. So this is not only for Muslims, but also among the Christians. And concerning the permit for the construction of churches, he said there are also mosques around here who has no construction permit. If I should close all these places of worship, I should also close the mosque, not only. So they renew the permit. That's how the conflict dispute. I would like to make some observation out of these two cases and other cases that we have learned. First, both disputes have been resolved fairly, and religious community group, minority group in both places are also now able to make use of their place of worship. But it was too slow in Kupang, 2002 into 2016, and relatively quick in Yogyakarta. Here, I think the leadership of regional assistant Pak Tommy is worth underlining. Meanwhile, the region of Kupang has played the issue of FKB for political reasons, for winning the elections. And secondly, I think we need to underline this simple fact, because there are long and controversial disputes of this type that remain unresolved today, until today. We have the cases in Bogor, we have also cases in Bekasi. In another directions, the two cases show the urgency for local government to facilitate the establishment of FKB and support its running and mandate by the PBM. In some places in Indonesia, the plan to establish FKB has been consistently rejected by local and dominant religious elite, precisely for the reasons that one of FKB's functions is to provide recommendations with regard to the construction of place of worship. It is for this reason that in Sampang Regency, for example, said in one political campaign 2012, as far as I am the region here, there will be no FKB, because one function of FKB is to precisely make that permissions, and this is local wisdom. In Sampang, there will be no mosque, there will be no churches, only mosque. That's local wisdom, he said. Interestingly, second, in both cases, let me finish with this, with the third one. Yeah, with third one, which is concerning the role of civil society. Both in Yogyakarta and with Lombok, the support from civil society and NGO activists working on peace and pluralism issues played very significant role in pushing reconciliation among disputing communities. They empowered the position of minority groups so that the minority group could negotiate their cases. They bridge the gap between the gap of communication between disputing communities, between Muslims and Christians in both cases, and especially among the youth. Their role are similarly crucial in encouraging and in controlling the government at the local and national and provincial level to solve the issue fairly. In West Lombok, for example, we've seen they have successfully monitored politicians from manipulating the issue of FKB for political reasons in 2012. I'm looking forward to Q&A with you all. Thank you. So, really hope that this is a little bit of good news from Indonesia.
Thank you very much, Ihsan. Sandra Hamid, we have to rush on, please. Silakan.
If you cut me short, I will be angry like Serena Williams. If you think she is scary, you have not seen an angry Minang woman. So watch it. So, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We have been talking about Islam. I haven't heard the word being uttered, so salam. Words of thanks to Pak Greg, Ibu Roni, terima kasih Indonesia Project. I'm so honored to be back here. My paper presents Indonesian state and society's attention to issues in and around intolerance, radicalism, and terrorism. In particular, we are going to see the actions of both states and communities. Terlalu keras ya? Minang woman. In particular, we're going to see the actions of both states and society in the last 18 months, during which time strong narratives against the issues have been documented. An increased interest in the issue potentially could be a good basis to support Indonesian minorities. However, to date, we have yet to see the national debate on pluralism, on tolerance, to be benefiting the minority. To explore the issues, this presentation will ask questions of why the renewed interest. It will consider what actions are taken by state and communities in response to intolerance, radicalism, and terrorism. It will discuss the implications of actions of the Indonesian states and community to Indonesia's democracy, and it will consider the implication, what implication do these have to Indonesian minorities. In exploring the last point, the paper will look at 3 cases: Ahmadiyya, Shia, and indigenous beliefs. I will begin with the proposition that there have been 2 watershed events which have contributed to the growing interest at the national level to issues related to pluralism, tolerance, and anti-radicalism. First, the religious-driven mass mobilizations which we have heard about plenty in the last 2 days. Second event is the terrorist attack in Surabaya. It is important to note that I am not proposing that 2 events are related and connected. The point I am making here is that reactions of states and communities, reaction of state and civil societies, show that there is an imaginary connection between the 2, that their actions are lumped. I argue that this is simplistic, not productive in dealing with real problems of intolerance, radicalism, and even terrorism. And more importantly, it is not helpful to minority. So here we go. Gimana sih? First, Ahok. We all know, we have heard, that the downfall of Ahok was prefaced by the largest religious mass-based mobilization in recent history, brought together to defend Islam, which Ahok has been accused of offending. It is also important to remember that the religious center mass mobilization was also, in turn, prefaced by an increasing usage of religious rhetorics since at least 2012 in Jakarta. In other words, what we saw in Jakarta 2017 was a crescendo from rhetoric to action. It is a crescendo of the use of a religion in electoral politics, at least in Jakarta. We have seen in 2012, Roma Irama defended Fauzi Bowo, and one of his strategies is to paint Jokowi to be having a non-Muslim mother. It was haram to elect non-Muslim. We all know about this, is well documented. Then we saw in 2014, the usage of religion went up several notches. At that point, both camps heavily used religion symbolism openly. Just one small example, in 2012, when Jokowi was accused of having a non-Muslim mother, he was interviewed and he said, I have gone to Hajj in the past, do I have to go public with it? He said, it's a personal thing. Hajj is a personal thing. So in 2014, on the other hand, after the presidential campaign, we all remember that he went on a small Hajj, and it was widely publicized. In 2 years, it has changed. Some see this as an attempt to strengthen his credibility as a Muslim, to respond to the accusation that his family was communist descent, non-Muslim, and so on and so forth. Parallel to that, Jokowi's camp also attacked Prabowo's mixed faith family. In other words, rather than getting out of the debate, both sides got deeper and deeper into the rhetoric. And then 2017 happened. It is still fresh in our minds how religion was highly used then. No longer it was a rhetoric, it was action. At the height of it is a call to ban Ahok supporters from receiving service in mosque upon their death. No comment. And following 2012 and Jakarta election, there has been rich discussion on what they mean to Indonesian political landscape, to the next elections. At that time, also to what this means to local elections, and so on and so forth. We have yet to work on understanding what this means socially, so I'm really pleased to see the survey that Burhan and Marcus just presented. I would be curious to know, for example, what this means to those not in the in-group of what is perceived to be the awakening of political Islam. How does this inform social relations? Now, I want to turn to the second watershed event that I've mentioned. The bombing, as have been widely reported, killed 28 people, injured 57, taking place in May, with churches being the target. Among the dead include civilians, police officers, terrorists themselves. It created a very chilling effect because very soon after the attack, we learned on media, on TV, how it was actually well orchestrated, that it was actually more than what actually happened. The police rounding up across the country also sent a very chilling effect that these people were everywhere. For the first time also, the attack involved children, which immediately raised the question of education, community upbringing, what happened to us, what happened to our value. And this concern is consistent with what some have been flagging for many years, but generally they are ignored and, by the policymakers and also general public. Education, public exposure to more exclusive outlook of Islam have been discussed for decades by civil society and academics alike. For example, the importance of Ulama Council fatwa in narrowing critical thinking, space that has been flagged for for at least 2 decades. Fatwa against liberalism, pluralism, for example, have been the focus of research by many people, among other the conservative turn that we saw up here from Van Bruinissen's. Public expression of Islam has also been carefully documented. Pak Greg has done important work on that, and Consuming Islam, that discusses the usage of Islam in banking, entertainment, choice of words in everyday conversation, and so on and so forth. And I have myself argued elsewhere that this movement is felt in the daily life of many. Preliminary work on this shows that social relations are actually changing, and even long-held tradition of communal activities are also shifting values. In a way, intolerance is normalized in everyday life. Now, at this juncture, I would like to conclude the discussion on 2 watershed events with these 2 points, that the mass mobilization of Muslims in electoral politics that have brought Ahok down has to be put in the context of changing social relations brought about by the more prominent presence of exclusive practice of Islam. When Surabaya happened, with the chilling effects that we have discussed, state and community responded. And in their response, we can see how what essentially a religious populist movement orchestrated around election time was subsequently linked to extreme violence events. A strong shade of a pluralistic country under attack was clearly on display, as we talked about the response later. Rhetoric and actions taken by both state and communities will be the focus of the remaining part of this presentation. The state responded by cracking down the terrorist networks, understandably so. Various reports stated that almost 200 were detained, 20 of them killed on the spot. The state also responded in cleaning up the house. For example, in May this year, National Body for Combating Terrorists, BNPT, used a research finding that revealed prestigious state universities, some of whom I'm sure there's some Indonesian alumni of this university, UI, ITB, IPB, Undip, ITS, UNIR, UNBRAW, UNER. These are prestigious state universities. There's a study that says that they have been infiltrated by the radical groups. These state universities subsequently made very public announcement that they are cleaning the house, that they're fighting radicals, that they're fighting terrorists. UGM, in fact, did a restructuring of the masjid, of their masjid. Indonesian government also took the opportunity to extend its control, to exert its control to the perceived radicals or extremists. In this slide, the HTI banning was used as the cause, and they would go for speakers that supposedly are linked to HTI. Further, the government also issued a positive list of preachers who are considered to be moderate. And lastly, the government cracked down social media accounts and websites perceived to be spreading radical teachings. In one unpublished report, the researchers who interviewed police said that at least 10 accounts were brought down every day that had hate speech or hoax or radical content. In the meantime, narrative connecting 212 movement as a radical movement is also common. Clearly, while analysts and scholars understand the movement consists of various personas, of various groups, they're not just one group, most people don't understand this, including sometimes government officials. So in this picture is an official from the Office of the President, and she suggested as much, that 212 consists of radical, is indication of radical movement. So we start to see these claims of characteristic of terrorists. If you see this description, any group within Islamic group movement can fall under this category. They lead an exclusive life. They often call others kafir, always claim the truth. The question is, are these really characteristic of terrorists? Are these not closely describing maybe conservatism, maybe even piety, or simply intolerant? Another state's response we documented while picking up old is the picking up of old researches done by CSO that was more on intolerant issues, then state turned it into to be radical and terrorism issue. For example, P3M in 2012 launched a research of intolerant messages coming out from 41 mosques that they researched out of 100. For the longest time, the research didn't go anywhere, but all of a sudden, angry Minang woman, but all of a sudden, it is actually picked up about radicalism. So, and the community, how about the community? Similarly, we see memes circulating on social media on the characteristic of terrorists. Labeling and banning are two strategies taken up. Basically, those not considered to be promoting tolerance are at risk to being put in the same categories of radicals. Among many organizations, NU affiliated by Ansor and Banser are the most active. And there's also this link between civil society and the military. So we see this more and more these days, the linking between the military and the civil society in bringing down terrorists. I will now turn to the next part of our discussion of the paper, were consequences to democracy and to the plight of the minority. For democracy, I don't think I need to belabor the point. Tom Power has already rang the bell very loudly yesterday. Clearly, we have seen that strategies long applied by intolerant groups and criticized by religious tolerance activists are currently being applied by those supporting pluralism. Labeling, persecution, banning have been taken place. In the past, CSO have been reaching out to police to stop the intolerant groups from doing so, and now they're doing it. Fighting over academic independence have been an important issue that is on our agenda for the longest time, but now we welcome the state to clean up the university. In other words, the threat to our democracy is clear as civic movement to protect tolerance crosses paths with anti-radicalism and anti-terrorism work. In the next 3 slides, I will be talking about the renewed interest in the issue and what are the consequences to the 3 groups, and I will be fast. So nothing in this slide is new to any of you looking at issues of minorities, and I'm given the theme of this conference, this might be familiar to you. We know that the Ahmadis have been the target of persecution, most notably since the issuance of Fatwa MOE in 2008. Small group of right activists have been supporting them continuously for a long time, and enabled them to get public access to public service. As late as May of this year, there was a persecution in Lombok Timur. But the national movement, national discourse, does not go there at all. They're not present in the discussion of what has happened in Lombok only a couple of months ago in the hoopla of anti-intolerance in the national level. Put differently, support to Ahmadis have not gone up. The same thing is also observed in the Shia community, a case that most of you also may be familiar with. Sampang is still continuing to have a problem. They are not back there. They are continuing to be persecuted. Cases are not resolved. Again, like the Ahmadi case, there has been no new support. And what happened to the indigenous belief? This is the last variation of the same theme, right? How much the celebrated Constitutional Court decision in recognizing the indigenous belief has come to a halt. We've heard about this a little bit yesterday. The point that most activists told me about why it was a success, and the success have been discussed yesterday, why it was a success and why now it is a problem, because during the time in the Constitutional Court, it was done quietly. And then when the court already made their ruling, MOE turned it into a controversy. And then it became attention of a lot of people, and that's when the Ministry of Home Affairs put things on a halt. So, despite the loud noise to support tolerance in post-Ahok and Surabaya attack, the plight of the minorities has found no further support. There is no incentive to publicly advocate for them. Their strategies remain the same, CSO being very quiet, fearing actually the mainstream attention to them, and the mainstream becoming more and more intolerant, as we have heard before. In other words, the challenge to work on this issue does not come only from intolerant groups, but actually also from the mainstream Indonesians, Muslim, as Greg Philly actually has written about in the past. So, conclusion. I would conclude with this point. Mass movement anchored in religious identity, as seen in Jakarta 2017 election, has to be understood as part of a social phenomenon beyond only events around electoral competition. The movement has to be put in the context of a long, sustained development which has increased the presence of religion in the public sphere. More than simply increasing a sense of piety, this development has also altered social relations at the community level. After the Surabaya attack, we found convergence of reactions, lumping together the reaction to increasing exclusive outlook of Islam with radicalism and even terrorism. The community strategy of labeling, persecution, while some have started before Surabaya, became more intense after. This has given the state legitimacy to take the same course of putting various categories of intolerant groups into radicals and terrorists all in one box. This, as I have argued, is detrimental to our democracy. It has continued the trend of narrowing civic space, but this time done in the name of protecting tolerance. And for the very marginalized groups, the religious minorities, we have seen that there has been no benefit of the national attention to pluralism. One last note, which I have thought about after hearing Tim Lindsay's remark yesterday to Sidney Jones' question. Tim stated that civil society is one of the most important sources for reform, our hope for reform. And therefore, as I read my talking points last night in preparation for this morning, I realized that how high the stake is. Civil society has been the strongest pillar in advocating for tolerance. But now, many of them found the need to take, the quote from Marcus, illiberal strategies to deal with undemocratic forces. I saw that in Tom's presentation. This may say something about what they are facing. This may say something about the level of their concern of the risk posed by the phenomenon in front of them. Nevertheless, if we are to continue putting our bet on civil society as the leader in safeguarding tolerance and reform, this trend of them taking illiberal action against intolerance, against terrorism, against radicalism is really, really concerning. This should not be encouraged, and I think everyone here is responsible to be reminding each other, so you're part of civil society, you're part of the academic, of the danger of going down that path. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much, Sandra. I'm glad you, as umpire here, I'm glad you managed to keep your inner Serena under control. It didn't appear. Now we may just take a small bite out of the morning tea, but very small. We have time for questions and comments. Please keep your questions and comments short, and please indicate who it is on the panel that you would like to direct them to, if anyone, so that we can get as maximum number. And we'll take 3 questions at a time. Okay, one here from different parts of the hall. Robert, up there. So 1, 2, another one up there. Yes, lady there. Yeah. Okay, please.
Okay. My question is to Marcus and Burhanuddin. And your research showed that intolerance increased with education level, which is not only counterintuitive, but there's a whole truckload of research showing that in general, higher education, one of its major outcomes is increased tolerance. Now, admittedly, that research is primarily in Western countries. So my question is, why is the reverse in Indonesia?
Next, Robert.
Robert Cribb. It's also for Marcus and Burhan. You offered to comment on prejudice and intolerance amongst non-Muslim groups. So I'd like to invite you to do that, especially in relation to ethnicity.
Yes, so I have a question to Mr. Muhtadi. So it relates to the religio-cultural intolerance graph. So you show it from 2010. Mr. Muhtadi, did you? Okay, so, right. So the graph is about religio-cultural intolerance. Should I stand up? Okay. So it's about religio-cultural intolerance graph that you showed from 2010 until 2018. Yeah. So it seems to me from 2016 to 2018, the trend is quite stable, unless you can give me a statistical significance difference between those two. And then the second question is to Mr. Marcus. I'll keep it short. This is related to the same graph. The 2010 and 2011, the intolerance is already high. Do you think this demonstration is only just a switch on button? So it reminds people again that they are intolerant, and then now it's a norm that but everybody is becoming intolerant, becomes a norm, so they become intolerant again. Thank you.
Marcus and Burhan, would you care to respond?
The first question, classic modernization theory assumptions that higher education leads to lower intolerance. Again, our data shows that in the Indonesian case, that doesn't necessarily work. We have published on that in separate articles. You might want to look that up in the Asian Studies Review. Our attempt at an explanation is here that between 2010 and 2016, the state promotion of bodies, agencies that were very prominent in spreading, disseminating this intolerance led to the higher educated, the higher income Indonesians, the elite, to become more prominent among this pool of intolerance. And concretely, we're talking about the support of the Yudhoyono government towards the MOE, which really happens only under Yudhoyono, which means that in that period, intolerance becomes part of a state-protected agenda, and it also means that elites are strengthened in mobilizing intolerance, while at the same time, and I'll come to that, intolerance within the broader population actually is declining. So we see an elite consolidation within that pool of intolerance. Burhan, now to Robert Cripp's question.
Thank you very much, Robert, for the question. So basically, we also have a number of questions to measure the level of intolerance among Indonesian non-Muslim. By asking quite the same question, for example, we ask non-Muslim whether they mind or do not mind if Muslim being president, if Muslim being governor, mayors, if Muslim holding religious events in their neighborhood, if Muslim, building places of worship in the neighborhood. And no, it's not surprising, basically, the result. So we found a significant difference. For example, Muslim intolerance toward non-Muslim in terms of political intolerance is very high, more than 54, scale from 0 to 100, but the level of intolerance among non-Muslim in terms of Muslim political tolerance, just only 15. And in terms of religio-cultural intolerance of non-Muslim toward Muslim, it's just only 11 compared to almost 50, scale from 0 to 100. So it's not surprising because maybe they're minority, right? But of course, what we are saying is that because lots of criticism last year when we presented our result, and why we focus just only on level of intolerance among Indonesian Muslims last year, this year we put a lot of questions for non-Muslim respondents. But of course, because the sample of non-Muslim is around 15 or 14% of the sample, we cannot disaggregate which non-Muslim being more intolerant rather than, for example, whether Catholic or Protestant, Hindu, we cannot say that. We just say that non-Muslim in Indonesia more tolerant than Indonesian Muslim. And
yeah, so the third question, of course, that's a very complicated matter to discuss. So you have, for a long time, these two trends of intolerance go different ways. So political intolerance goes up throughout this entire period of the Antioch Demonstrations, but religio-cultural intolerance actually continues to decline even as the demonstrations are taking place. Now that has now come to a stop. Again, I would point you to these articles we've written on that. Our explanation for the continuation of the decline of intolerance during, or religio-cultural intolerance during the demonstrations is that in fact the demonstration leaders had exactly sent that message. If you are demonstrating against Ahok, that doesn't mean you are intolerant. You're just demonstrating against Ahok's blasphemy, just demonstrating for Al-Ma'idah 51,
but you can still be friends with your Christian neighbors, you can still be friends even with the Chinese. So that was entirely compatible with the message of the protest leaders. So, but what we see now in the 2018 data is that in fact you can't really separate these two issues. At the end of the day, if you spread the political intolerance message very loudly and systematically, at the end of the day, religio-cultural intolerance will be affected as well, and that's the narrative we put onto that data.
Ihsan, you want to respond to that question? No. Sandra? Okay, we'll take 3 more questions. Over here, Sydney, and right at the back there, yes. And on this side, yeah. Sydney.
Thanks very much. This is a question for Ihsan, because in a way, your 2 case studies showed conflict resolution in spite of the FKUB, not because of it. And so what I would like to know is it possible that the FKUB turns somehow into a positive institution because it's inherently discriminatory, because it's based proportionally on the number of adherents to a particular religion in a particular community. So while I thought you were going to start out by saying what a positive role the FKUB had played, in fact, what you said was it was civil society or it was Tommy Harahap, but it wasn't the FKUB. So I'd like your comments on that. And just a comment on Sandra's paper. When we've had references in this conference thus far to civil society, it's always been to good civil society. And in fact, civil society in Indonesia is increasingly dominated by Islamist groups as well. So just to add that to the mix. Thank you.
Okay, up there, Trina. Yes.
Trina Sobit from Mapalus Kawanua. A question about the contribution of mixed marriage to pluralism. What happens when a non-Muslim boy wants to marry a Muslim girl? Thank you.
And over here, yes.
Yeah. Hello. So I'm Henry, and my question is directed to Sandra. That's an awesome presentation, Bu Sandra. But I'm quite interested in the construction of the figure of terrorists, particularly in this let's say in the times of war on terror by Western countries. So I would like to ask Bu Sandra about whether this kind of like counter-terrorism or de-radicalization efforts are actually linked to a transnational trend of war on terror. Because as I have seen increasingly in Indonesia, there is some kind of transnational funding channel to counter-terrorism efforts in Indonesia. So I would like to see this kind of, transnational linkages between the local and the global war on terror, let's say. Thank you.
Okay. Several questions there for Sandra, but we'll start with Ihsan. Your response.
Start with me? Yes, thank you, Sydney, for the questions. It's very interesting. And I have that in my paper. I have not enough time to deliver it this morning, before. I think why FKUB important is that it is essential in the issue of that the construction of a place of worship, simply because it is their mandate. So even if civil society, so any problem should be dealt through them, not because of them or by them, but at least through them. So civil society and local government could civil society should do something through this FKUB. So we need to do something with this FKUB. So I am Sandra and others from now on start empowering their capacity in doing conflict resolution or mediations. So part of our program now is taking training for some FKUB members with that National Mediation Center in Jakarta. That's kind of that. We also published a book toolkit for FKUB. I just published this early this month. Published also by the center, by the office of Pak Lukman Hakim, so it has a legitimacy there. And what we wrote, what we said in the book is some technique in doing conflict resolutions and mediations, the correct mediations. That's other thing. Another thing is that it's very important for local civil society too. Again, in contact with the FKUB, in some part of the, and I think this is good news, some of the activists in Banjarmasin, for example, in Pontianak, became a member of the FKUB. 2 months ago, I asked this Nurholis Majid, someone who is very known widely for doing pluralism advocacy in Banjarmasin. He is now part of the FKUB. And I think you did a report on Pontianak, and you said, I think early August, you said that one reason why violence didn't take place in Pontianak is that there were civil society doing certain things in there. Actually, that civil society is ours. It's Paramadina, and working with Mafindo, Anti-Hoax Center. We established the Anti-Hoax, the first Anti-Hoax Center in Indonesia, actually, in Pontianak, and also working with the FKUB. And this FKUB, the head of the FKUB of the Kalimantan, I think West Kalimantan, right? Yeah, West Kalimantan is a professor in a state Islamic university. He is very enlightened. So we did that campaign against the use of identity politics in Pontianak with the FKUB. So FKUB itself, as you know, there are conflicting, ambiguous role played by FKUB, but we can do something through FKUB by asking more civil society activists to be involved in FKUB, and also communicating with the FKUB to control them somehow. And because their role is essential, because it is only through them that the permissions to have the place of worship is possible. Otherwise, so they are still, I think, they are very weak. We are doing database on them, mostly laki-laki, very small number of women, kalau ada. Very small number of people. So we did a campaign for FKUB to be more gender sensitive and that kind of stuff. So I think don't leave them because their role is essential in writing a permission to this kind of stuff. So another thing that from Reformasi era is that they have to negotiate with people. I'm done.
Okay. Thank you. Now, Sandra, you have several issues to respond to.
2 issues, actually. Nggak mau, kamu aja.
It's Tim. It's Tim job.
Yeah, the Tim Lindsay to answer the mixed marriage. But just very quickly, Sydney, I think you're right that there's a lot of things in the mix right now. But one of the points that I'd like to make is actually the ones that are actually usually doing work to protect tolerance in a way right now is being sucked into taking actions that are not necessarily for tolerance. Easy examples would be how Banser usually is the one protecting Ibu Nur buka puasa bersama in masjid during Ramadan, right? Look what they're doing right now, right? And so it's something that is, I think, of concern. So it's not just new actor, but I think the same actor shifting to another side. Now, on Henry's question, I don't think I have data on that. But what I can say is this, that a lot of the donor money from the States, from Australia, with this whole countering violent extremism money, or CVE, is coming to Indonesia, right? And I think with that also some perspective of how to deal with terrorism. And in it also, it comes also with some perspective on prevention. And a lot of the civil society that actually do not have capacity or history in the past working on terrorism, working on de-radicalization, all of a sudden found themselves in work related to that issues. They usually work on pluralism, promoting tolerance and all that, and all of a sudden their language change and they have to consider radicalization as well in that. Just very quickly on kawin campur, it's very hard, I'm not an expert, but if you want to marry in the mosque with Islamic, with KUA, Marriage Registrar's Office, it will be impossible. You will have to register your marriage as a civic marriage. But Tim will know more.
Okay, now I'm going to take a couple more questions. I'm going to take a little bite out of the morning tea, but they keep the questions very short over here.
No, we wanted Tim to respond to the mixed marriage issue because we were all confused about that.
Yeah, Tim.
Is that on? Yeah, thank you. In Indonesia, there's 2 stages to a marriage. A religious marriage has to take place, and then that can then be registered, and it's only on registration that the marriage actually exists as a valid marriage in Indonesia. So the question for mixed marriages is whether the religion in question tolerates a marriage, an interreligious, interfaith marriage. And of course, the general principle for a Muslim marriage is that a Muslim man can marry a Muslim, Jewish or Christian wife, but a Muslim woman can only marry a Muslim man. That would be the normal position, and that would make most interreligious marriages impossible. Not all, obviously, but most of them. And then, of course, the position of other religions also can be limiting, although less so than Islam. It depends on the sect in particular, the particular stream of the religion as to whether it will tolerate a marriage. But if you are in one of the categories that's not tolerated, then you can't have a religious marriage, and it becomes extremely difficult then to have a marriage that can be registered. What I would say to finish this off is that practices differ, however, around Indonesia, and there are certain areas where the registry is known to be extremely tolerant and not to apply the rules, and interfaith marriages that are probably impossible according to religion can still be registered in certain places that are quite well known to people, although that's really just because the registry ignores the rules. The last point to make is that actually Indonesia recognises marriages made overseas. So there are certain circumstances in which people can go overseas, get married in a marriage that's probably not legitimate in Indonesia, and it may then in some circumstances be recognised in Indonesia. So how's that for a ridiculously complex answer to a straightforward question? Good luck.
Okay, now I'm going to take one more question, provided it's a very ultra-short question. Yes, thank you.
Natalie Mobini. It's a question for Pa Ihsan. Is any or much attention being given within the FKUB to the kind of relationship building that can happen before the fire breaks out? And you know, is there space and resources for work in that area? And I'm also wondering whether they have any current structural ability to involve the others. Which I guess is the kind of groupings that Sandra is speaking about, the ones with whom dialogue would be most difficult.
I don't answer the second part of the question. Can you repeat the second part of the question, please?
Whether there's currently any ability for them to involve not just the main recognised groups, but unrecognised groups as well.
Yeah. That's not possible. As I said, as Sydney said before, the member of the Congress should be representing the majority of the religious group in certain places. So it's in the province, it also depends on the number of the religious communities there. But in certain places, such as in Surabaya, in East Java, I know that there are the vice governor has that wisdom, has that decision to also involve some representation from the Confucian community, which is also in terms of the number, the Confucians are not that big, that it's only small. It actually cannot be represented by even one member of the FKW, but they have that wisdom. So it's possible actually. It depends on the vice governor or vice mayor who actually run or actually facilitated the establishment of FKUB in certain place.
Can I just say something, Pak? No, just this is that I will be writing the paper with my colleague here, Muhammad Mustafa, and I prepared the presentation together. Just want to make sure to give the credit.
Really?
We'll have to bring down the curtain on this session at this point. Morning tea will be served just outside the building here, and please return to your seats here for the next session at 11 o'clock sharp. Jam 11 bang. And would you join me in thanking our speakers?